And he released a report last year after a year and a half of traveling around the country looking at some of the big problems facing us. And he said very clearly that the Constitution is not the problem. He listed 3 major impediments to meaningful land reform in South Africa. The first amongst these, he said, is the government has not put its money where its mouth is when it comes to land reform in South Africa. And if you look in that chapter 3 of that high-level panel report, it's got some terrific graphs there, which shows our government expenditure on land reform has simply just not kept pace with the requirements. To the low point in the last fiscus, where 0.14% of national expenditure was spent on land reform. Now, you can't say you're serious about land reform in South Africa and you're spending 0.14% of your national expenditure. And to just give you some perspective on how small that is, government spent more in that financial year on VIP protection services for cabinet ministers than they spent on the entire land reform program. Spent more on VIP protection services for cabinet ministers than they did on the entire land reform process. So it actually shows you completely that the money has just not followed this particular process. But then as well, Yaseen, the former president of the Republic of South Africa, my old sparring partner at the podium, Mr. Zuma, is now going around KwaZulu-Natal and other provinces, whenever we'll give him an audience these days, saying that the reason he was pushed out was because he was pushing land reform. Well, if you have a look at the high-level panel report, there's a very interesting graph there as well, because it shows you that in the year that Mr. Zuma took office, the number of hectares that were passed over in terms of land reform to land reform beneficiaries went on a massive downward trajectory, with the result that in his last year in office, this great crusader for land reform in South Africa reached the lowest point since 1994. So quite the opposite. The second thing that the high-level panel report identifies as a problem is what they call elite capture. Now, Alan, I like to say elite capture is a polite word for corruption, because it is. And it shows how the many land reform projects in South Africa that should have gone to beneficiaries to benefit and improve their lives has been subverted into the hands of a well-connected crony elite. And probably the best example of this, and most public example of it, is the Yaseen dairy project in the Free State, where huge amounts of money went into buying and purchasing a dairy farm, and it was going to be handed over to a local group of beneficiaries, land reform beneficiaries, but instead, along the way, got subverted into the hands of the Gupta family. And the proceeds and capital from that mysteriously made their way to Dubai, and then came back into South Africa, not in the service of the people of South Africa, not in the service of those land reform beneficiaries, but in the service of paying for the Gupta wedding at Sun City. So poor South African land reform beneficiaries, who should have benefited from that program, were ripped off, and the money that should have gone to them was spent on a wedding for multi-billionaire corrupt business people in South Africa. And there's story after story in the high-level panel report about how land reform projects have been completely subverted and abused and have benefited a group of connected individuals rather than being broad-based empowerment of previously disadvantaged individuals. And then the third problem, which the high-level panel report identifies as one of the key impediments, is the issue around the poor legislation and poor drafting of legislation around land reform in South Africa. And so while the Constitution says you must ensure that you've got this legislation, the legislation has been drafted, doesn't speak to each other, it's contradictory in many aspects, and it's made the process so cumbersome that it's slowed up the whole system. And so they recommended that we scrap all these existing pieces of law and have one overarching piece of legislation that would look at speeding up land reform. And I think that we can do this, and I think we can have meaningful land reform in South Africa, but it's going to require the will of government to be able to do this. So, unfortunately, the Constitution is the easy way out. That's a scapegoat. It's not the real problem. You can amend the Constitution all you like. It's not going to ensure that we speed up land reform in South Africa. And so why are we so obsessed about Section 25 of the Constitution? Well, because it's not the land clause, it's the property clause. And I think a lot of people don't understand this, and I think a lot of South Africans, particularly in urban environments, have lulled themselves into the sense of complacency that this debate that we're having and this process that we're having is something that affects farmers and agricultural land only. It doesn't, because Section 25 doesn't speak about land, it speaks about property, and it's very clear at Section 25(4), where it says property is not limited to land. So property can be anything, any tangible property. It can be shares on a stock exchange, it could be a house, it could be a factory, it could be an art collection. Even Ontiveros pearls wouldn't be safe under the property clause. And so we need to be very, very careful about unstitching this important clause in our Constitution. It was one of the compromises that were made in the constitutional drafting, and property rights and strong property rights underpin every successful economy in the world. And if you look at countries on the international ratings, those with strong property rights, who protect property rights and entrench them very carefully in their law and ensure that people's property rights are protected, have much stronger economies than those where property rights are vulnerable. And so a country like America, whose whole economy has been built on strong ownership of property rights and being able to remortgage and refinance going forward, the GDP is far higher, the infant mortality rate is far lower, and the incidence of poverty is far lower. You compare that to countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe, where property rights have been massively diluted and are insecure, and you see precisely the opposite. GDP plummets, the incidence of infant mortality rises dramatically, poverty and the incidence of poverty rise dramatically. And so we don't want to unstitch this important section of our Constitution, because we believe that it underpins the very viability of our economy going forward. And it's going to be very difficult to attract international investors. It's going to get very difficult to get local investors to have confidence in the economy, to build factories, to be able to bring the type of jobs here that we need to absorb the unemployed in South Africa with this property clause at risk. And so I think it's been heartening, certainly in the last week, to see the ANC rowing back on this amending of the Constitution. And certainly the comments made by the President last week in the House are the clearest indication yet that I think his party is starting to have a rethink on this, having seen now the implications that it has for the economy. And I think it's due to parties like the DA and other civil society bodies who've been out there on hustings across the country, alerting people to this, and I think investors are starting to say, well, if you want us to invest, make sure that our investments are going to be safe going forward.